Listen, the budget was yesterday. There is, of course, talk of potentially a general election on the cards in 2025. According to the polls, Sinn Féin currently well out in front at the minute. Do you think, was that a big consideration whenever we see in the front of the papers everything is about tax breaks, giveaways, one for everybody in the audience?
No, it was not an electoral consideration because there will be another budget 12 months' time before any general election in 2025. So our focus really was on enabling people to come through what has been a significant cost of living pressure over the last 2 years on people. And in addition to that, then, to take new initiatives as well. As our population increases and as our population ages, we've also taken steps to provide for the future for young people today, for 20-year-olds today and 30-year-olds today, in terms of the next 10 years, that we would have funds put aside into a savings fund that will earn money, that will pay for services into the future as we age, but also then that we would provide funding for ongoing capital investment in infrastructure, in light rail and buses, in things like the metro, in housing, and so forth.
And that is interesting. You're talking about future-proofing, climate, a $3 billion budget for that. But we always see these top subjects normally in a budget about health and housing, and they just seem to have been shoved to the side. And one thing that the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, promised that it was going to be a budget for children, and Focus Ireland has said that the government has failed to deliver its promised children's budget with nearly 4,000 children who are homeless, that they are entirely forgotten is what Focus Ireland says. What's your response to that?
But that's not true. I mean, there's $5 billion in capital being spent on housing. This year we will have a record number of social houses built in 2024, over 9,000, up to 9,600. We will provide 11,000 overall when you take 1,000 from leasing and 1,000 from acquisition. But we'll actually build over 9,000 social houses, which is a record in decades in terms of house construction. And then about 6,400 directly assisted affordable houses by the state. And if you take the First Home scheme, if you take the Help to Buy scheme, which we've now said will also continue right into 2025, if you think of the grants that are available in terms of vacant houses or derelict houses, there's an enormous suite of schemes and funding available to increase housing output, because we need to build more houses. Last year we built over 30,000. This year we will reach our targets again, but we need to go beyond that. And money and capital will not be a challenge to us in terms of housing. The challenge is more on the delivery side, to get through planning more quickly, to get through the various stages of projects, to get more modern methods of construction into play so that we can get more houses built more quickly.
I mean, you said that, Asher, that's not true. I mean, yesterday, I'll be honest with you, it frustrated me a little bit seeing the coalition almost slapping each other on the back. Congratulations, because, of course, we do have money. But the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, said that he wants Ireland to be the best country in Europe to be a child. And we spoke there, Muireann, about the 4,000 children that do not have a roof over their heads at the moment. We also speak about the CAMS situation. We had a psychotherapist on yesterday who declared the mental health situation and the availability of mental health to young children as like a third world country. There's 4,000 children on a waiting list for just a one-off appointment. And then, of course, we were speaking last week, we had people on about their children needing spina bifida and spinal surgery.
Yep.
That they're in a race against time and they might have to wait for 5 years to get this. So when you're saying it's not true, like, I mean, there's 8,000 children, over 8,000 children there who will not be slapping themselves on the back, who will not be delighted about what's been offered yesterday.
Well, Tommy, what I said wasn't true was that housing was sidelined in the budget. That's not true. And it just isn't good enough to sort of make superficial and shallow comments about very serious issues.
But what I did say
I just make that point on housing. No, hold on. No, Tommy, I didn't interrupt you.
Okay.
And I would appreciate the opportunity to give my perspective on it. And on the housing front, over the last 3 years, there's been a dramatic change in house construction and in house delivery. And that is objectively there in the metrics in terms of the number of houses built. Now, in terms of Ireland being a third world country, don't take my word for it. Look at the UN Quality of Life Index and look at most international indexes in relation to Ireland. We need perspective on this. Ireland is not a third world country in respect of the services that we provide. We do have huge challenges. Of that, I'm in no doubt. And in terms of the health service, yes. And in terms of spina bifida and scoliosis, the issue will not be resources in that regard. Again, as we've seen recently, it's about delivery of services and the utilisation of that funding in an effective way and in a safe way and in a quality environment. And there is an inquiry underway in relation to particular aspects of that service, as we know. And also, over 20 million was allocated to that service last year. And we do need to find from Children Health Ireland as to how that money was used to deliver. There has been an increase in the surgeries. The number of surgeries that took place has been an increase, but the waiting lists have gone up. And the Minister has asked, what is the correlation between the money allocated and the number of surgeries and getting the waiting list down? So we're focused on that issue and we remain focused on it.
I am trying not to jump in here, but I do have to say that we have a lot of messages in, and certainly a lot of them are on CAMHS. And Mary just said, the CAMHS, it's broken. What investment has been put into that? Because we haven't really heard much about it.
There has been significant investment put into CAMHS over the last number of years. The biggest issue is not financial. Again, it's not the financial allocation, it's recruitment of psychiatrists. Particular parts of the country have found difficulty in recruiting psychiatrists. We had that in the South Kerry area. But in other areas, they have recruited the necessary number of psychiatrists. And that has been the greatest hindrance to the development of CAMHS. But on the broader level of mental health for children, we have invested, particularly in non-governmental organisations and projects like the Jigsaw and so forth, and then in education and the wellbeing programme in schools, because there's a broader issue around mental health in terms of prevention, in terms of nurturing good, positive mental well-being, and we are investing in our schools to that end, and also investing in organisations within the community that can assist young people to cope with undoubted mental health pressures, and particularly post-COVID, that has been the case. But I do acknowledge and I accept your point in respect of the challenges around CAM and the particular model that has developed in terms of psychiatric-led model. That has been challenging in terms of recruitment and retention of multidisciplinary teams, but there has been expansion of the service over the last 3 years, and certainly over the last decade. There's been a huge change in terms of provision of CAMHS, but it's not where it needs to be.
No.
And it's not just a resource question.
Yeah.
It's not just a resource question. It needs, in terms of organisation and recruitment, are big issues.
Yeah, something that has been brought up time and time again. And of course, mental health will also lead on to our health service. And we currently have what has been described as the worst ever overspend, a budget of 22.5 billion for our health service. There's a core expenditure there of just 800 million this year. That's kind of seen as, running to stand still. We have a huge number of doctors and nurses leaving our service, taking their skills somewhere else. And we know every single year, it's like the trolley crisis gets worse and worse. It's like we're trying to hit these numbers of people in trolleys that get worse every year. What are we doing to stop that, to get to the core of what is wrong in our health system? Because we're going to have Strep A. We've already had it's already been mentioned about that. Flu crisis, COVID hasn't gone away. Are we just going to have higher people in trolleys again coming in the next few weeks?
Well, Miriam, we've actually recruited 22,000 people into the health service in the last 2 years. So rather than you saying thousands are leaving, thousands have come into the health service. We do need balance and perspective in the narrative. And that's not taking away from the huge pressures that are on the health service. But 22,000 extra people have come in over the last 2.5 years. That is the case. And in terms of our health service more generally, health outcomes have improved in Ireland very significantly compared to, say, a decade ago or compared to even 5 years ago in terms of cardiac health outcomes. And we now top the EU league table in terms of lifespan. Now, that didn't happen by accident. There's other factors. So we can't sort of create the context that it's somehow a third world health service. It has expanded, it has grown. You've mentioned yourself, in fairness, that it's a 22 billion investment now, and we have a huge overspend for this year. And I think it's going to continue to grow because our population is growing and we're living longer and ageing, which is going to create more pressures. And in terms of, we've come through COVID, but there will be increased number and frequency of viruses like Strep A and so forth, and other challenges for children, in particular with RSV, which we had over the last 2 years. So vaccination, prevention in that respect is very important in terms of the broader issue of the flu and COVID. But yes, there will be pressures. If you look at the United Kingdom and so on, they're in even a more difficult position than we are. But that's not something that we take any solace from.
No,
we have to continue to work to improve, not just emergency, by the way, but I think the key issue is the quality of healthcare. The key issue is outcomes, that we improve our cancer outcomes, our cardiac outcomes, our stroke outcomes, which we have been doing successfully over the last number of years, but which rarely gets acknowledged.
As you say, listen, there has been no shortage of investment. The question is a lot of the time, where does that money go and how effective is it? I do have to ask you, Tánaiste, as well. Listen, you are the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Of course, we're seeing the war between Hamas and Israel at the minute. You were one of the first European ministers to visit Israel back in 2010.
Gaza Strip, yeah.
The Gaza Strip. Do you feel what you saw back then, that this escalation was inevitable?
First of all, I have to say that the savagery of what happened last Saturday has shocked me in terms of the random and indiscriminate killings of innocent Israeli citizens, and most, as we heard yesterday, babies horrifically killed in family homes. And I didn't see the extent of that coming. And I think it represents a pan-Islamic jihadist approach by Hamas, which must be condemned. In terms of, and then I think while I would accept that Israel has a right to self-defense and have a right to deal with Hamas, there cannot be collective punishment of the Gazan population. And anything that is done must be done in accordance with international law, and also that humanitarian aid and support has to get to Gazans and has to get to Palestinians. And that's why at yesterday's European Union meeting, I was very clear on Ireland's behalf that there should be no disruption in development aid or in humanitarian aid from the European Union to Palestinians, be they in Gaza or in the West Bank or indeed in the refugee camps in Jordan and elsewhere, and that we will work with the United Nations to try and help the people of Gaza, the ordinary civilians there who are now reaping the impact of the war between Israeli armed forces and Hamas. It really is depressing. When I was there recently, we were very conscious that the situation was deteriorating rapidly, and we were quite depressed coming out of the region because we could see no future in terms of the political process or in terms of moving to a two-state solution. But I must say what happened on Saturday, I think, took the scale of it over. I think we're looking at 1,200 Israelis killed now, and now we're looking at 850 to 900 Gazans killed. And the real worry is, I think we need to de-escalate because this could implode across the region into Lebanon and the West Bank, with further untold misery on the people of the region.
And Tánaiste, can I ask you in relation to that? Obviously, you've just said there how that this could have an effect and it can spread its wings. And of course, we've got the war in Ukraine and what's going on there. And that doesn't look like it's going to be over any time soon. I know that the EU are preparing for this to go on for 9 years. So I'm just wondering in relation to that, all of these do have effects on every country across Europe. And Brexit has had knock-on effects, and nationalism does appear to be coming back in a way that we haven't seen in Europe in quite a long time. Because, of course, there are refugees from these crises. Do you worry about what's happening in Ireland and how we're dealing about this rise in anti-immigrant sentiments?
I do worry about it. And as Minister for Foreign Affairs and indeed Defence, I'm very conscious of the growth in conflict all over the world and indeed climate change impacts. And these conflicts, these wars are fueling migration. Without question, Russia and Putin have weaponized migration. That is why they're terrorizing the civilian population, bombing infrastructure, bombing residential areas. They're actually hoping that millions will and have succeeded in causing that migration from Ukraine. We see the same in Sahel and in Africa in terms of the coup d'etats, the jihadists coming to greater superiority in the regions there. And so many young people want to leave those locations for a better life. And that has implications for countries all over Europe. And we're witnessing that in terms of the growth of the far right And we have to be very conscious in Ireland that we don't facilitate the growth of the far right here in terms of their terrible views and their approach to dehumanising people who are fleeing situations where there's immense danger and poverty. It's very worrying. I do worry about where the world is right now.
Yeah.
And the Middle East is the latest manifestation of it.
But it feels like there's a view in Ireland, certainly with the Gardaí, to not engage in an awful lot of things that are happening. I do think one of the most worrying things was seeing your faces with gallows on them outside the Dáil by certain groups. So do you think it's best to just kind of keep a hands-off approach and hopefully that all this will fix itself? Or do we have to go, right, we can't tolerate this?
I think there has to be a firm response to any attempts to inhibit freedom of movement of people on our streets. That's a very fundamental right in a democracy, irrespective of whether you're a politician or not. Many media people are feeling pressure as well, as you know, and there's this kind of pressure that if you don't report in my direction, I see a lot of increased attacks on media outlets online by groups who feel our view isn't being representative, and that's very worrying in a democracy. So yes, there has to be a firm response. And I think particularly in terms of how we manage protests, in terms of making sure that people are not allowed to disrupt the normal toing and froing of a democracy, where people should be allowed walk the streets of our towns and our cities without freedom of harassment, being shouted at, or intimidating groups encircling people. That is wrong.
I'm sure this is something
that's something I would be very concerned about.